What's up, Internet? We are here at the end of the year, and you know what that means. It's time for another list of easily digestible information that people like for reasons that might actually mean my channel gets seen for once, and that's a nice feeling. We already did the good list, so it's time for the other list. And let me tell you, this one is much more other. This is the top 10 poop games of 2023. The worst games I played over the course of the year 2023. And I have to say, this year it's actually quite difficult for me to make this list. Like, the good list, I had 20 other games left over that I wanted to be put on that list. This one I was struggling to come up with 10 that were really, truly awful. A lot of them were just sort of mediocre and disappointing, honestly. But I managed to kind of make this happen, so I hope you enjoy the worst games of 2023. But before we begin, we have to, once again, observe the tradition of the Golden Lagoon Awards for awkward, jank, or just plain bad games I played this year that I couldn't stop playing because they were enjoyable for everything wrong with them. I'm going to put a caveat next to this year, though, and that is that we're also going to include early access games because they're not finished, and they might not ever be finished, and they have issues, but I like them, and it means that I can add more things that I wanted to put on my other list that I couldn't here, so we can start off on a positive note. So there's that too, so look forward to these games. And yes, this is a Golden Lagoon cart I handmade for this exact award. And yes, it does still play on my Super Nintendo, and I'm very proud of it. Anyway, Golden Lagoon Award winner number A is Onirism. This is an early access third-person platformer shooter adventure thing I like to affectionately call a splat in time. Primarily because it has bright, colorful, cartoony graphics mixed with a bunch of different game modes, a really interesting adventure, and a lot of awesome platforming and interesting mechanics all interwoven together. I could not stop playing this game once I did a first impressions video on this, and this ate up about 2 weeks of my life. But that said, it is in early access still, and it has a lot of problems. First and foremost is the fact that it's still in early access in spite of the fact that it's getting very nearly close to the 2-year anniversary when it was originally supposed to come out of early access. And it is not in anywhere near a playable state. That's pretty bad. I mean, you can go to like the second area and you can count individual seconds between frames, and it'll be like that until everything loads in for about 10 minutes. It's not pleasant. The overall frame rate when the game actually wants to start working is still pretty bad, honestly, and there are just a lot of little things and big things that are unfinished, and I just find quizzical. And the most awful thing about it is this is being updated relatively frequently last I checked, and yet every update seems to just be adding more and more stuff instead of fixing what's here to actually make it playable, and that concerns me greatly. Not only does it feel like the overall vision of this game is going to be obscured with all the cool things they thought to add along the way, but they might not actually finish and make this game anywhere near presentable or playable, which sucks. All the voice acting is in French for some reason, which wouldn't be too bad if also all the combat dialogue wasn't in English because consistency. Some of the hitboxes and wonky hit detection means you just sometimes die. At one point I fell through the entire world and landed on what I think was a kill plane but didn't end up dying. So I was just wandering around in an abyss below the stage itself. While this game kind of supports controllers, which is nice for my physical hand impairments, you can't play this game entirely with a controller. The moment you pick up an item or go into a menu or go to a store, you do need a mouse to get through that because they didn't program it properly for controllers, which is quizzical because everything else works perfectly fine with controllers. Even though it has a bit of a busy control scheme, it works. But that said, I still quite love this game. The protagonist, Carol, is in this amazing, fantastical world, and she does not give a toss about it. It is kind of a one-note character, but I really do appreciate just how much of a breath of fresh air you have this character surrounded by all this amazing things, and she is having none of it. She is just deadpan and angry, and she just wants her teddy bear back. That's her whole mission. And she doesn't care about anything else in between her and that, and I kind of appreciate how this character is written. Every single area in this game feels unique and different. You start in like this whimsical fairy forest, and then you move to a volcano. Then you move to a forest top like village that also then suddenly turns into like this dome of horrible like science, and like it's a giant biodome. That's so cool. Every area has a different set of enemies that all have different sets of weapons, and oh yeah, you can carry like 8 weapons plus a side weapon at any one time, and like there's a million different variations of everything. I particularly found myself really liking the rocket launcher that shot bees, even though that's a ripoff of something that was in Skylanders like 10 years ago. I love that idea. You can change your character's skin because there's multitudes of different skins and outfits you can get, and while I had trouble getting them because you're supposed to be able to buy them in stores and none of the stores seem to change their stock, even though it's supposed to be location based, I may have bugged that because, again, this game is wildly unfinished. I enjoyed just how customizable Carol was. The shopkeeper is an excellent example of how awesome some of the characters are. She's a witch that's basically a talking hat, and she's amazing. This game and this world are so fascinating and interesting, and it's really fun to play, and it sucks that it's unfinished. It was supposed to be finished like years ago. It was supposed to get out of early access years ago. It feels like it's nowhere near ready for that, and the fact that I see so much positive in this game just hurts so much more that it's not finished. I cannot recommend this game, especially at full price, but you know, if you want an interesting third-person shooter that's also a platformer that's like every off-brand platformer from the PS2 era mixed with like Splatoon and stuff, I think you could have a lot of fun with this. I certainly did not want to go back and play more of this, but I would wait until it goes down in price or it gets finished because it is unbelievably rough. Golden Lagoon Award winner number B is another early access game, but one that is substantially more complete, although it's not there yet. We have Dread Delusions, a game I would have loved to have put on the other list. This is a first-person RPG adventure game set in an incredibly dark and macabre world. Everything is just off about this world. Like, this is entirely speculation on my part because the game doesn't outright say it or anything, but I'm pretty sure the entire world is actually the brain of a dying god, and I can say that because your entire world is a series of floating islands orbiting a neuron. How wicked is that? You can find a bunch of gods hidden in this world too, and you can make meaningful choices as to how they interact with this world and how you try and maybe not revive the world, but how you try and bring it back from the brink, or at least help let it exist for a little while longer. This game has a lot of factions and a lot of deep questions that it's asking you to make, and different choices you can make for building your character, and I love that. The entire world in its 32-bit PS1-ish era visuals are absolutely awesome. It's dark, it's creepy, the concepts are all over the place, and in some cases really spooky, and it's just conceptually a fantastic game. That said, it is unfinished. The story is not quite done. It is buggy in a few different ways. I remember at one point, a shopkeeper decided not to sell me a plot important item because I sold something to him, and that like broke his inventory at one point, although I think that's been fixed. Currently we have 3 islands we can traverse, plus a few smaller ones you can look around in. You have a faction system, you have equipment that actually makes you invisible to certain factions so you don't get attacked on sight, which is nice because the combat in this game is completely naff and you can avoid it entirely, which has actually created a dominant strategy of pretty much focusing entirely on speechcraft and magic lockpicking, because physical lockpicking is just a dice roll every time, no matter how many points you put into it, and putting points into combat sucks because combat's not particularly enjoyable one way or the other, but you will be locked out of stuff if you don't upgrade your speechcraft and your magic lockpicking. So there's definitely a specific, better way to build your character in this. But you've got about 3 or 4 different weapons, a slew of magic, including one summon that's been added recently, and that's kind of fun. Even though the combat itself isn't all that great, you've got a world with some really creepy lore that was just fun and engrossing to explore. I think I've got something like 20, maybe 30 hours into this, and it reminds me a lot of another game on my other list that you should definitely go watch. But Dread Delusions, it still has a long way to go, but I think this could be a really special game, and maybe when it finally comes out of early access, maybe it'll see the other list. That said, if you like RPGs, if you like spooky adventure games, if you just like big open worlds that are just a little bit off kilter, check this one out because it's kind of amazing. Anyway, let's get on to the proper list with number 10. Re-Legend, a game I would absolutely love to recommend because I actually had a lot of fun with this game, but I can't because it has so many issues. For one thing, it feels unfinished and incredibly buggy. At one point, I think I spawned in a wall and couldn't get out and just had to restart and lose a day's worth of progress, so that's not so good. It is ostensibly a monster collecting farming game, kind of like Rune Factory, but with more of a focus on it being like a combat Pokemon sort of action RPG. It's a lot of fun when it wants to work and when it feels like a fleshed out game, but that's not too frequently. The controller support barely works, although it does for what it's worth. And a lot of features just feel very badly thought out or just sort of half thought out. Like, trying to harvest crops in this game is absolutely frustrating. You can actually see me in the footage. I have to actually try and harvest the crops 3 or 4 times before I'll actually pick up one And I've got so many crops that basically if I were to actually harvest everything perfectly the first time, I'd run out of time in the day. And these are renewable crops that show up every day, so I've kind of screwed myself out of an entire month of stuff to do, just focusing on these crops. That's on me, fine, I'll accept that, but that's if actually harvesting the crops works. I have to do this multiple times, and that's before you have to actually scare away the fish to pick up your water crops, because if you don't, you'll have to contend with the fact that they will eat your crops, and this is effectively the water crop equivalent of watering your crops. It's just something you have to do every day. So on top of missing picking up crops that you're right on top of for whatever reason, you also have to go through and actually like deal with your crops in like triplicate if you're lucky. This is basic farming stuff and the game won't actually let you even do it. Why? How do you screw this up? Honestly, I gave up at this point. The thought of doing that for the sake of just collecting crops at the start of the day, which would take an entire day because it takes way too long to do any of this stuff, was massively unappealing to me. In my attempts to actually gain some profits so that I would ultimately be able to better fund my endeavors and adventures, basically remove the entire game from the game, and I just had to focus on collecting everything, and that was not a very pleasant experience. That said, the actual adventuring is pretty fun. You have to collect monsters that can ultimately help get you through various fights. You can evolve them, and some of them have multiple splitting paths of evolution, and they all look really, really cool and interesting. The monster designs in this game are great. The character designs are pretty fun. Your different equipment can actually change how you physically look, which I always love that. That's a little thing, but it's something I absolutely love. And you can build up other skills and stuff depending on how you want to actually play. There's a lot going on in this game, but it all feels very surface level and like it wasn't fully fleshed out or planned out, or you are ultimately farming to make money so that you can go adventure, and that's sort of it. There's so many things in this game that aren't properly explained, such as if you want to go to the Dark Isle to try and grab materials so that you can make a dark monster, that's only like 1 day a week if I remember correctly, and nowhere in the game does that tell you as far as I can recall. This game feels like it needs substantially more love than it got, and it seems kind of outright abandoned by its developer at this point, which sucks, because I see a great game here. If there's just a little bit more time and effort put into it, it could truly be a fantastic monster collecting game, a fun little adventure game, an amazing farming game. There is a lot here to like, and yet none of it's properly polished to the point where I could say that it's enjoyable. And that's what kills it for me, because I was having fun, or at least I thought I was, but at the same time, maybe it was Stockholm Syndrome just from having to spend so much time with the thing. I wanted to see my monsters grow up and evolve and become something cooler. I wanted to see my farm truly thrive. I wanted to go do various activities within the village, and yet it feels very, very hollow and devoid. Doesn't hurt that the writing is also not particularly great. I don't think it was well translated or something from what I remember. But either way, this almost feels like a game I could recommend on so many levels, except it falls flat on every single one of them, and that's what hurts the most. And honestly, I've got somewhat similar feelings for number 9, Lunela. This is, let's be honest here, it's a collection of pre-bought assets from presumably the Unity asset store. I've seen several dozen games this year that use the exact same anime pink trees in them, and well, they might also be on this list, just wait. But this game I kind of really enjoyed, and yet it still feels just so far away from actually being enjoyable. Let me explain. This is an online RPG, not quite MMO, although I think it might have been branded as one at one point. You can play up to 5 players at once, and for an indie game, that is absolutely amazing. You have 8 different playable characters that each have 3 different sort of classes to them. As you evolve, you can increase them. And it's basically just a giant open world action RPG, and it's got an amazing scope. But a lot of the game doesn't actually properly work. For example, similar to Onirism, you can play the game with a controller, kinda, except that none of the menus work without a mouse. You can pop open a map sometimes, and sometimes it will just refuse to close. I don't know why. There's a huge world out there, and yet it's pretty empty. There's basically just enemies out there, and that's about it. There are a small handful of secret gems you can go collect, and I actually found this really engrossing. You'd find like a Chaos Emerald hidden in like the most awkward place, and you'd have to find a way to mess with the physics to get it. And While those gems were really fun to find, ultimately they were pointless because all you got for getting them was some expendable materials to upgrade your gear, and that was sort of it. You can't find treasure and gear and other interesting things out in this world. It's just the Chaos Emeralds, which sucks because all of your equipment is basically given to you through grinding basic materials and your standard leveling progression. That's what you get, and it sucks. I was actually having a lot of fun with Lunala, to be completely honest, even though it is not really a particularly great game. But the thing that absolutely stuck the final nail in the coffin of this game for me, that, again, not that great, but I was at least kind of enjoying my time with it, was it does that thing MMOs like to do where if you die, you lose typically 10% of your experience. Except in this game, it's about 30% of your experience, and if you find yourself in an area where you're fighting enemies that can just one-shot you, and bear in mind, I was in an area where I had like 10 levels on the enemy and they were still one-shotting me for some reason. Yeah, if you die enough, you won't de-level, at least visibly you won't seem to, but your experience could go into a negative value and you'd have to earn that back before you could actually start working on actually leveling again. You could go into an experience deficit where you couldn't even see what your experience values were anymore. That's awful. The HP recovery in this game is just incredibly, painfully slow as well. So if you are, by some reason, actually enjoying your time with this, like I kind of was in a weird twisted sense, you will just periodically have to stop and wait quite a while before you can actually start doing things again, just to let your HP recover, which is not the best. And weirdly enough, enemy stats seem to be based entirely on their physical size and not their displayed level. Like, I'm currently level 41. If I fight a giant at level 10, in one attack it'll axe half my health, and yet I can fight something that's close to my level that's like half my size and it will do basically nothing. I just don't understand. The enemy stats don't seem to actually correlate to anything. It's just weird. In spite of the fact there's an armor slot, there doesn't actually appear to be any armor in the game. At least I certainly couldn't find any. And in spite of the fact I have a familiar equipped, it doesn't fill out the part in the equipment for a familiar? I just don't understand what this is all about. Maybe this is just a cosmetic one? I don't know. This game does not explain itself in any capacity, but it could just also be straight up broken and I'd believe it. There's nothing really there to explore. I'm not saying putting chests with different weapons and stuff would have fixed all of that, and certainly I don't think this game could do that because every character's moveset and animation is tied to their character model, which, again, I'm pretty sure is pre-bought, so there's not a ton of work being put in here with the actual characters being developed, but this game needs something to utilize all that space, and it currently has nothing. There's a chat function, and, you know, it is sort of an online game, provided you could find other people to play it, but there aren't any. And it just feels like this game doesn't have any real development push behind it. It's just a collection of assets all thrown about in hopes to get your money. And the fact is, it was fun for a while. I think I've sunk about 15 hours into it. I had an absolute blast exploring this world entirely by myself, even if it was entirely underwhelming. And yet, with just a little bit more effort, putting more meaningful content in this huge environment, maybe actually making some bespoke characters and animations and stuff, you could have something here that might actually be remarkable. Maybe not fantastic, but it would certainly be good. As it stands, this game is not that, and it helps less because the developer also has 3 basically identical games in their catalog on Steam as well, and they have another game that looks pretty much exactly like this but with a different art style as well. It feels like they're kind of just churning out a bunch of asset flip games. Like, I don't want to call this an asset flip or anything this developer's doing an asset flip, but at the same time, they've got so much of a push to just make more and more of these games and not actually fix or improve the ones they've got. The last update for this game was back in August, and that was just announcing that it was on sale for the summer sale. There's so much this game could be if someone wanted to put all the time and effort in the world into it and actually make it a good, interesting game, but as it stands, it's a big, open, empty world with very little to actually make you want to explore it, and that sucks because I actually kind of see promise here. Number 8, JASF, Jane's Advanced Strike Fighters, a console sequel to what I understand was a like 90s PC hardcore simulation game that could best be described as dollar store brand Diet Ace Combat, but without all the insanity and like fun stuff removed. Seriously, I like flight sims, especially arcadey ones. I think I'm obligated to, what with Ace Combat having a character named after me in it. But this is the most boringest flight sim I think I've ever played. And I mean, it is really just trying to be the most bargain bin, low quality, dry and dull flight sim you could ever find. If you've ever played an Ace Combat game, you've basically played this, except that, you know, there's at least vaguely anime insanity involved and, you know, Death Star nonsense where you have to fly through absurdly small locations. This is trying to effectively be as standard and realistic as you can get while still being a arcadey game. And it feels like it's at odds with itself because, you know, if you're going to go with a realistic simulation, you're probably not going to go with a console-based game to begin with, which would make sense considering that, again, this has its roots in more realistic PC simulations, and yet it still goes for the more arcadey style. So you've got a very dry, very bland, fairly by-the-numbers story with not terribly interesting or exceptional gameplay or mechanics, but then you have it sort of mixed with an arcade style, which really does try to lean in more to it being more extravagant, but it never gets to actually apply itself to anything. It's very weird to see the concept and the actual structure of the game so at odds with each other to create the blandest game that could actually be interesting I have played in a very, very long time. And the saddest thing of all is, if you're playing on PS3 like I am, this is by default the best Ace Combat game you've got. Because let's be honest, Assault Horizon isn't even actually Ace Combat. Barely memorable, and if I didn't actively track and keep tally of exactly which games I'd played this year, I would have entirely forgotten about this, aside from what a waste of time it was. Number 7, Shadowrun on the Genesis. Let's not confuse this with the really, really cool Super Nintendo game that, while not my taste, substantially better game, let's just be honest. Shadowrun on the Genesis is an exercise in how not to start your game. I played this game for about an hour, got out of the tutorial, I think, and was absolutely miserable to the point I didn't want to play any more of it. And that says basically everything I need to say about this, but to be more specific, what this game does is it starts you in a hotel. Says you owe this guy a debt before you can actually get your actual objective as to what you're supposed to do, and then sends you on varied, randomized, radiant quests. You just have to wander around this map, hoping not to get shot at while you wander to various locations, hope you found a place that has a job for you, do the job, which involves you wandering to another random location on the map and hope you got it right, and again, try not to die. If you die at any point, you have to restart, and you have to do several of these in order to actually make enough money so that you can pay off your debt, at which point, again, provided you haven't died and lost all your progress at this point, you're then just told to go somewhere else. That's it. You're not actually given any real direction aside from go here to this vague town. So from what I can make of that, I assume you're supposed to just do more Radiant quests until plot happens, or you die of old age, or boredom. Both will happen very quickly if you play this thing. I was checked out at this point and I didn't want to play any more of this ever again. The only point in this game that actually had me interested in continuing this adventure, in giving me any sort of meaningful motivation as a player to progress, was at one point while I was doing the Radiant quests, I walked into this one building filled with really high level enemies that absolutely destroyed me, and I wanted revenge. But that was the sole motivator this game had. And while I don't want to compare this to the Super Nintendo version, because they're completely different games that only share the same title because they're based off a tabletop game of the same name, in the Super Nintendo Shadowrun, you start life in a city morgue with no memory, and you have to figure out who you are, who tried to kill you, what's going on. You have to go on this varied quest where you only get small little teeny tiny breadcrumbs of information and intrigue. At one point, you have to befriend a dog in order to solve a puzzle, just so that you can get a small snippet of your starting premise of what you're supposed to be doing in this world. That is how you start a game, by making it so interesting that the player needs to know what's going on, and it compels them to move forward. Not just telling them to do random crap over and over and over, grinding up money so that you can then start the game. I get that you might want your players to actually know what they're doing and have a little bit of experience and stuff, but the game doesn't explain any of that either. You're expected, I guess, to have the manual, which I don't, which is not helpful. But just starting your game off by grind and not actually giving the player any sort of premise or intrigue or any sort of motivation whatsoever is such an awful way to start your game. And I have no interest in going back to this one. Number 6, Waifu Impact. Oh dear lord, this thing. Alright, here's a fun story. I reviewed this earlier this year. You won't find that video on my channel yet because it's literally just sitting around waiting for a moment where I've got nothing else to put out, and I honestly just have zero motivation to put it out so that anyone knows about this game. That's how bad it is. I've put in the work, and I just don't want to talk about it. That's how bad this game is. But, ostensibly, it is a game that is primarily defined by being so aggressively subpar and boring, and entirely comprised of pre-bought assets. You'll notice the trees from Lunalia in here, as well as probably other things. It's trying to capitalize entirely on the fact that you might mistake it from Genshin based on the title and kick it a few bucks, and then maybe try and stick around for some titillation, but it's on the PlayStation, so you don't even get that. It's pretty bad. When I started this game the first time, I had no ability to shoot, which is a bit of a problem, what with this being a shooter game, and your whole premise here is to run around this one island, very small island, mind, shooting this one person over and over and over and over and over again. Okay, well, I say that, but there is actually a second enemy. If you manage to actually kill that one girl over and over and over and over again, 30 times, a giga bigger version of her appears, and she's easier to kill because she's a substantially bigger target. Good luck with that, by the way. It takes like 15 minutes, and it's a total waste of time. Once you've done that, you've pretty much done everything this game has to offer. You can take part in some very clumsy, bad platforming challenges. Bear in mind, this is a third-person shooter, and the animation is abysmal in this game. So every time you jump, your foot will clip into your butt, and you'll sort of try and dangle off cliffs, just desperately trying not to fall to your death. Although there is no fall damage, you'll have to redo all these platforms just to get tiny little stars, which, after you collect all of them, and I don't believe the game tells you this, you can then go to a smaller island and do gauntlet matches against enemies that are randomized. But again, there's only the one girl you shoot at and the bigger version of the one you shoot at, so really the only thing that's randomized is the number of what you fight. If I remember correctly, on like round 7, I fought 5 of the really, really big girls, and then on round 8, I fought 2 of the small girls. I think it's randomized, honestly. It was just bizarrely mispaced. And there's nothing here. This is like the biggest nothing burger of a game I think I've played this year. There's just tedium. The only other thing you can really do is see how high the kill counter gets, and I can confirm that it goes past triple digits. In fact, I tried to take it to quadruple digits, except that if you pause the game at any point, it resets the kill counter, and yeah, that was about 2 hours of my life wasted, but there's just not much going on here. I think the one positive thing I can say about this, only positive thing, is you do have multiple different characters which have zero customization whatsoever, but they each have a different weapon that behaves slightly differently. And I remember the girl with the sniper rifle being ridiculous, because anything in her reticle at any distance just dies instantly. So this random girl is actually the Death Star, and that's kind of awesome. But yeah, all this game is a cheap cash-in to try and make money off of you misspelling Genshin's name, I guess, and expecting titillation, and you'll ultimately get neither with this. At like $8, this game costs an egregious sum of money for what little you get. Like, seriously, you have less than 15 minutes of actual content in this game before you'll have a platinum trophy, if you're really one of those people, I guess. For, 5 times the price, you could get Senran Kagura Peach Beach Splash, a game that actually is designed to be about titillation, and while I don't care about any of that, it's also an actually good game. You have characters that have entirely customizable designs and outfits for special abilities, collectible cards that change how you fight, plus your different accessories and stuff that actually change how you go about combat. You have the ability to upgrade stuff. You have different weapons that each give you different movement options. While that game is ostensibly about titillation, it's actually a good game. And while it does cost about 5 times the price that Waifu Impact does, it's actually a game. And it's actually good. And even saying the two in the same sentence makes me feel sick. Waifu Impact is horrible, and I honestly bought it just to make fun of. And after I made my video, I still haven't put it live just because nothing about this was fun. Not even talking about it, it just makes me angry. And I still have like 3 other games I've bought on PlayStation that are basically in the same bucket of this is designed to titillate you, but it's probably just crap. So here's to the new year where I'm gonna have to do that, I guess. Still have to talk about Skylight Free Range at some point too. Seriously, that game is not good, but it's interesting to talk about at least. Number 5, Wizard of Oz on the Super Nintendo. I tend to find this is pretty divisive. Usually people will say it's like the worst game ever, or you'll get the defenders that think, no, everyone who says it's the worst game ever is just wrong, it's just misunderstood, and I'm kinda just sorta in the middle. Honestly, it's not a good game, and it's really clumsy and awkward to play around in. But by bringing this up, I can show you the shortest demo play I think I've ever seen in a game. You ready? This game is so bad, it doesn't want to play itself, to show you the demo of it. Seriously though, this game is kind of awkward. It's slow paced, you move very, very clumsily, jumping is very awkward, and when there's like any degree of precision platforming, it's not terribly fun in any meaningful way. The first stage has a teleporting maze, which is always a good sign. It's really hard to hit a lot of enemies because you have to use like projectile attacks that use like sort of a lobbing arc a little bit. And they are a limited resource based on what you collect on the environment. So everything about this game is kind of leading you towards avoiding combat as much as possible, but you kind of can't get around enemies all that much. Plus, like, the first stage is just filled with lemons that drop from the sky because lemon drops, you know, like over the rainbow, except they come out of nowhere and you don't really expect it, and it feels almost like a very basic I want to be the guy sort of troll moment in a game where you don't have the reaction time to actually avoid any of this stuff to begin with. It's not a horrible game, but I certainly couldn't get very far into it, and given how enemy dense some of the demos seem to make this game look, it looks like it's going to be a challenge to get any further in it. And I can say I wasn't really enjoying it, but it is more or less just a subpar game. It's not the worst thing ever, but it's certainly not fun either. But it does have the shortest demo play in like human history from what I can find, and that's, if nothing else, worth something here. Number 4 on this list, The Legend of Zelda: Tears of the Kingdom. This is a game that started out as an expansion DLC for Breath of the Wild, and honestly, it feels like it, because it's basically everything I expected from a bad sequel to Breath of the Wild. See, a good sequel, I've always believed, and feel free to correct me where I'm wrong here, but I've always believed a good sequel takes everything the first game did well, and fixes everything that didn't work. Now, I will openly admit I don't like Breath of the Wild. I think it did 2 things well, both in how pretty it was, not that that's really all that much to compliment given the game's budget, but also how open its puzzle solving was. And to be fair, that is still here. Unfortunately, it fixes absolutely nothing the first game's problems had. It had a giant empty map that still persists, it has terrible weapons that are made of basically glass, and that's still here. They did mitigate that problem with one of its new little toys, but mitigation of a problem is not fixing a problem, and I will always say that. I actively tried to utilize a bug early on in the game that lets you take the unbreakable Master Sword from the opening into the game. Unfortunately, by the time I learned about that, they fixed it, which sucks because if I at least walked around with a weapon I didn't have to worry about breaking or losing or anything, I could have at least had fun with this game. But this game is effectively just Breath of the Wild, except they removed all the toys from the first game to give you a new set of toys that are kind of middling. I kind of like the idea of going through platforms above you with physical swimming through objects mechanic. That's kind of neat. It changes the way you look at some stages. I do appreciate that. But other than that, the only thing this game really adds is the Lego car mechanics ripped straight from Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, and yet somehow they did it worse. Like, okay, my weapons are gonna break. It's gonna be a big empty world. I'm not really gonna enjoy this game all that much. The game's focus is entirely on shrines and Koroks once again, which I absolutely hate with a passion because that means there's no meaningful rewards nor meaningful content to actually interact with here, as far as I'm concerned. But you know what? If I can get my horse and get him the little bridle that allows him to carry a wagon on his back, I could go across the country and just have a nice personal introspective journey with my horse. That could be a lot of fun. Except the moment I go anywhere, the game forgets that my horse had a wagon attached to it. And yes, certainly you do have a power-up that lets you remember previous things you've built, but you first of all have to expend resources you may or may not have to utilize this, but also you have to unlock that, and the game should really just remember that your horse with a giant wagon bridle has a wagon attached to it. Am I crazy about this? I mean, heck, most of the Koroks require you to use that anyway, unless you want to wander them around by picking them up everywhere, which that's a huge waste of time. But okay, I can't have a nice personal journey with me and my horse. Fine, I guess. I'm not happy about this, because that was like the one thing I was actually kind of looking forward to. But you know what? I'll make a flying platform and I'll just fly around the place and just have fun that way. Except that all your handmade things that utilize energy require you to use batteries that you have to grind up and use various materials in order to keep powered. So you're probably not going to be able to actually use your flying machines or any sort of energy powered things for very long. And oh yeah, that's right. Even if you manage to do it, your flying machines actually break if they get a certain distance away from where you start, because they just didn't want you going everywhere by flying, because they didn't want you to have fun. This game is exactly what I thought it was going to be, and what I feared a Breath of the Wild sequel would be. It's Breath of the Wild, except just as bad, but they just added a few extra shiny baubles to make the children at home say, "Ooh, it's a brand new game and it's so cool and I have to have it." Except it's like the exact same game and just as bad as before. The only thing about this game I ended up liking was the fact that there were like 3 tiered maps on top of each other. And if you go to the bottom tier, it's pitch black and you just have to sort of wander around. And you could utilize light arrows to light it up, except I chose not to. And I just wandered around in the darkness trying not to get murdered and turning the game into kind of a survival horror. That was actually kind of interesting for a night, but that's about the only thing about this game I actually had fun with. Yeah, this game was a total waste of time, but on the bright side, because it's basically Breath of the Wild again, it's made people look back and realize how aggressively not great Breath of the Wild actually was, and I feel vindicated about that. So you know what? That's still kind of a win for me, but a massive loss for the game industry because we got more tripe to dig through. Number 3, Frantic Flea. This game looks absolutely gorgeous, just like Tears of the Kingdom, which is good, because that was the developer's intention from the start, was to make a game look like a 50s cartoon, and I think they more or less nailed it. Unfortunately, they weren't so much concerned about it actually being a game, and that's probably why this game is god-awful. Oh my god, this game is so bad. Okay, so you ever play Flicky on the Genesis? You know that little game where you play as a little bird collecting other birds and then leading them to a door at the exit? It's a lot like that, except if you made it incredibly incompetently, and that's already coming from someone who hates Flicky. Okay, so in this game, you are in a terribly small confined space with multiple platforms you have to jump between. The game moves incredibly fast, as does your character, and there's also slidey ice physics, which means enemies come at you fast, they're hard to react to, and you don't have a lot of time to actually react yourself to your own movement. You have to run around collecting various little bugs that I guess are the titular Frantic Fleas, unless you are. The game's not terribly clear on that. And you have to collect a certain number of them and then lead them all to an exit. It sounds horrible, but trust me, it gets worse. See, the fleas don't exist in predictable spots. They actively move around and will try and react to both you and your opponents, effectively trying to run away from everything, which makes it very, very difficult to actually collect the things. In addition to this, if you take any damage, they all scatter, every single one in your inventory. And oh yeah, in Flicky you only had to collect like 5, maybe 10 per level, and you could do it spread out across the entire level. In Frantic Flea, you have to collect like 25 in the first stage, and they all have to be with you at once. It is just unbelievable how abysmal this game is. Everything about this is just frustrating and awkward, and even just the movement in this game is so bad. Look, I'm awful at everything except Gotcha Force, I will defend that, but I don't feel remotely bad about my skills for taking like an hour to beat the first stage. It was unpleasant, it wasn't fun, and when I got to the second stage, I was done. I tried playing it for 1 or 2 deaths, and then called it a day because I was not enjoying any of this. This game was pretty much just there for masochists and people who really, really like Flicky, I guess. But it was a game designed primarily for its visual style, and that's kind of it, and it shows, because nothing about it actually playing is remotely pleasant. Number 2 on our list. This horribly overpriced piece of crap. Okay, so like, I'm not going to record any of this. I'll put something interesting up, maybe something good just to cleanse the palate, but oh my god. So I bought this Oculus Quest 2 for Black Friday last year. There was an amazing deal where for the price of 50% off, you got 2 free games and the device itself. And I think there was a few other upgrades to it, and that's kind of cool. I'd never experienced VR before, and I was kind of excited. Although, admittedly, I figured the thing would be a total waste of time and money, because it just seemed like such a bad gimmick that wasn't being utilized by anything properly, and at most seems like a dead end in the industry. And I gotta admit, I was not surprised by what was happening with this game. I went out and tried both games that came with it, both Beat Saber and Resident Evil. Resident Evil I did not care for, but I didn't care for Resident Evil when I played it normally. Beat Saber was one of the few actually functional games I found for it though, and while it was a lot of fun, unless you were willing to shell out a lot of money for all the extra songs or sideload a bunch of stuff, which I didn't know how to do, and I wasn't too keen on the idea of breaking my system if I did it wrong. Yeah, you're actually very limited with what you can play on Beat Saber, which is really disappointing, but also understandable with license fees and whatever. But after that, I tried investing in like a couple VR Humble Bundles and a couple things off Steam, and it was pretty much across the board a disappointment. The game's at best a tech demo, or at worst straight up didn't work. I remember at one point going for a safe bet and picking up Elite Dangerous because I loved it on the Xbox 360, and when I started, first of all, it was a giant pain in the ass to actually get working, but once I finally did get it started, it spawned me behind my character. I had to resituate myself physically to actually get there, and when I finally did, the game was running at 1 frame roughly every 20 seconds. Bear in mind, I was also running this in parallel on my computer, and it was running perfectly fine. I tried playing this straight up strictly on my headset as well, because maybe, having it connected to my computer was some kind of problem or something, but no. And I bought this game twice just to see if I could actually put myself in Elite, and yeah, it just straight up doesn't seem to work on the Quest. I was really excited about that one too, because I liked that, but I was like, okay, well, there's another safe bet, I'll just play Minecraft. Yeah, there's no actual Minecraft client out there for this, at least not anymore, at least officially, so that's great. I tried playing Super Hot VR, and that was, it was super hot, which was great, but it was a cut down VR version, so you really weren't moving around too much, and there was substantially less to do and was substantially worse than basic Super Hot. I could just go play actual Super Hot and have a better experience. Then there was a bunch of other games that were just, random tech demos that I tried playing here and there, and those weren't worth the time to download them. I tried playing an MMO because I love MMORPGs called Zenith, and while I did manage to actually get into the game after creating a character, it was stuck permanently on an infinite loading screen, and to my knowledge this has never been fixed, but other people seem to get into the game, but no one's playing it, so who knows. The only game I bought that I didn't bother actually playing was Half-Life Alyx, and that's because I needed room on my computer to actually record videos to make this thing, because that has an absurd install size that I'm not going to actually bother with. The fact is, this thing is a horrible waste of time and money, and it's just a waste. Like I said at the start, I figured this was more or less just a bad gimmick and a dead end in game development, and yes, it very much seems to be the case. And sorry, I don't know who said this, but I remember reading on a forum a post that put it pretty succinctly. People aren't buying VR games or VR headsets because it's cost prohibitive. They are not cheap, they're stupidly expensive, so people aren't playing them. And people aren't playing them because, they're not making games for them. And people aren't making games for the thing because people aren't buying them. And even if you have one, as I've learned since I just started recording this, well, the one that I bought not even a year ago at this point has been obsoleted because the Quest 3 now exists. So if you want to get into VR, you risk having to spend a lot of money for very little actual return, few games that actually work, fewer that are actually worthwhile to play, and very quickly everything you have will be obsoleted. This is made entirely for people who have absurd sums of money. I got into this just because I knew that this was the one opportunity I'd ever have to try VR, and it was exactly what I figured it would be, which is a total waste of time and money, and I cannot recommend VR in any capacity. But that said, it's not the worst thing I've played in this past year, because it's of course time for number 1, Wild Hearts. This is a game I want to forget ever existed and ever happened. It is not to be confused with Sayonara Wild Hearts, a much better game made by an indie developer that might be on another list you should go check out because it's pretty good. No, instead, this is kind of a knockoff sequel of Toukiden, made by the same people, and for those not familiar, Toukiden was kind of like a knockoff of Monster Hunter. That, in and of itself, interests me because I quite like Monster Hunter. Giving them some proper competition means that both franchises would have to step their game up. This is not proper competition. This was a horrible anti-consumer joke played by EA, because it's EA. Wild Hearts is conceptually pretty interesting. You go out into the world and you fight these giant monsters. The idea being that you use these crazy spirit traps that you can conjure up on the spot using limited resources to help take them out. And in another really cool feature, when you weaken monsters in certain parts using sectional damage, you could climb on them, sort of like Shadow the Colossus, and actually steal energy from these monsters to create more spirit traps to help take them out and weaken them at the same time. That's pretty clever, actually, on paper. Except none of it worked. Yeah, everything about this game was a horrible, 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 buggy mess. Frequently, people were complaining about stuff like hitboxes and all that sort of thing, of course. Everything in this game was broken at launch, which really freaking sucks. You know what sucks more? The fact that, as far as I know, very little of it's ever actually been fixed. If I remember correctly, there was a roadmap introduced at one point that was promptly abandoned, because of course it was. What's worse? Not even a year out and it's already been abandoned by its developers. Not even a year and it's dead. I wanted to have a lot of fun with this game, but they weren't willing to put in the effort to actually release a complete game. They weren't prepared to fix any of their bugs. Actually, that's not true. I found one beneficial bug day one that in less than 24 hours they fixed. If you were playing on PlayStation, you could, thanks to a bug, actually play multiplayer without PlayStation Plus for one day and actually have fun with this. But they couldn't have that happen, and so immediately the one actually fun bug of the game gets removed. They weren't going to fix anything else, but that got fixed. And you know what? Even if you wanted to hunt things alone, you kind of couldn't. You remember that cool Shadow of the Colossus climbing on monsters mechanic I mentioned a little while ago? Yeah, that's actually really cool if it worked. Unfortunately, the moment you mounted a monster, the camera would go absolutely crazy. It would like zoom in and spin around and it would like reverse and then auto-reverse your controls. It was uncontrollable. To give you an example of how bad this was, I was fighting a giant lava gorilla. Spoilers, there was a giant lava gorilla. And both of his shoulders were weak points. I actually weakened both of them so I could grab energy out of either shoulder to weaken him and strengthen myself. Unfortunately, I grabbed his face. Now his face is basically entirely flush with his shoulders, so I only really had to move an inch or two to the left or right. It didn't matter. But of course the camera went nuts and my controls started messing up. So I just decided I'm gonna hold left and hope for the best. Can you guess which shoulder I landed on? The left or the right? I'll give you a moment. Got your guess? Okay, so yeah, the shoulder I landed on was I climbed down the entire length of his body and walked off into the sunset. I wish that was a joke, but yeah, the controls just stopped doing things because that would have actually made it so that I could play the game properly. To my knowledge, they haven't actually fixed any of the major bugs, and it's bad and it's unplayable, which sucks because there's so many cool things about this. I like the giant traps that allow you to also interact with the environment and find shortcuts and create your own. That was neat. I liked that there was both sort of a human variation and a monster variation of every outfit you could craft from their materials. That was interesting. I even liked some of the weapons. The weapon I settled on was what I affectionately like to call the Parasol of Pain, a giant umbrella built entirely around parry attacks and building up a rapid hit counter combo, and then flying around. It was a neat weapon, but everything about the game was awful to play because it was never fixed. And all of these reasons are perfectly good reasons to put this on this list, but let me make something perfectly clear. That's not why I'm putting it here. I'm putting it here because it is a perfect microcosm of every single goddamn thing wrong with the games industry this year, minus like AI nonsense and microtransactions, because everything wrong with the games industry is here. We've got unfinished games, unfinished roadmaps, releasing an unfinished game, promising to fix it, not doing that. Bugs, actually beneficial bugs that are getting removed while the actual problematic ones get to stick around. The game being promised to actually be fixed and taken to a working state and then promptly abandoned by its developers. Oh yeah, and EA. Thanks EA for just being you. There was the sheer amount of avarice in this game. No, it doesn't have microtransactions or gacha, which is the one saving grace in all this, if there is such a thing, but and I don't know if this was just a local price point or whatever, but day one, I had to pay $105 for the standard version of this game. Like, not only were they going with the increase, well, it's a PS5 game, so we gotta charge $90. No, they tacked on an extra $15 because EA's just greedy like that. And I can guarantee you that none of that money got to go to the actual developers of the game. It went to some CEO's pocket so that they could continue to actually abuse the people and continue to take advantage of everything in the industry to basically become a giant money laundering scheme. It's just sickening to see that sheer avarice is destroying this medium I love more than anything else. It sucks to know that, greedy CEOs are actively trying to find different ways to chase infinite profits and to scam money out of, all of their customers, but especially the young and neurodivergent who have trouble dealing with all this stuff because, of course, gacha and loot boxes and everything like that. There's about a million things wrong with this industry, and Honestly, Wild Hearts to me feels like the perfect storm of everything that's going to be wrong with this industry moving forward and is today. And that sickens me. And I'd like to say that, well, we could just stick with the retro stuff, but there's plenty of commercial retro re-releasers out there that are willing to charge a lot of money and give you basically nothing. There was that whole Glover scandal back in February, which shows that, you know, even the people who are willing to re-release stuff are willing to actively hurt the industry as much as possible just for the sake of making a quick buck with minimal effort. There is so much wrong with this industry, and at this point, all I can say is stick with the indies because they at least have interesting ideas, and if they make a little bit of money, they might continue to make good, interesting things and ignore everyone else. And I hate that because this is the industry I love. This is the industry I've dedicated my entire life to. This is the industry I started studying and learning how to be a part of before I could even walk. And yet, all I see is bad practices, abuse, and exploitation. And if that wasn't bad enough, the creation of really bad art just for the sake of making a quick buck for scamming it off their customers. And it sickens me. And that is why Wild Hearts is absolutely the worst game of 2023. And I just don't want to allocate any more space in my very limited memory for any of these games, if I'm being entirely honest. But I have to admit, this year was mostly okay. Like, the first several of this list were more games that were aggressively average or disappointing than just outright god-awful. I think I avoided a lot of really terrible things this year. I didn't get to play Jedi Survivor or whatever it was. I didn't get to play Wolong Dynasty, which was apparently pretty bad at launch as well. You know, there's so many games this year that I just heard, oh, this is terrible, this is terrible, this is terrible. All of these are unreleased and unfinished. Why are people selling games like this? You know, I managed to avoid a good deal of it. And to be fair, I think I managed to do that because I spent most of my time playing Sega Genesis. So yeah, retro might be the best option, though maybe not from the people who keep re-releasing things with minimal amounts of effort, just saying. Either way, this has been my top 10 poop games of 2023. But what are your worst games that you've played this past year? Or games that are just worth avoiding and not worth mentioning at all? Because I should probably know about them, because I'm probably gonna have to play them at some point. Anyway, use the comments and let me know, because that's what it's there for. And, you know, if you enjoyed this, feel free to subscribe to the show so you see more of what I do, lots of reviews and other stuff. Check out my Twitch to see more streams. I stream every week, several times a week. Gonna be getting back into Mega Man in the new year, which is exciting. Currently doing some Bomberman stuff right now as part of a personal tradition of mine, but that'll probably be done by the time this gets out, but we'll see. And lots and lots and lots of RPGs, because that's kind of my favorite genre. Yeah. And if you really want to make my day, check out the show's PayPal, Patreon, or Ko-Fi to help support the show any way you can so that I can continue to do what I do to the best of my ability, especially in this new year where my revenue is going to be nosediving pretty badly. I'm dealing with some terrible life stuff right now. But yeah, if you could support the show, that'd be great so that I can keep making awesome videos or at least cut down my expenses and pay rent, because I would like to do that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to continue seeing you around over here. And if I don't, well, I hope you have a great day. But until next time, peace out, Internet.